Daniel and his friend said, we're not going to be subject to the king's leadership in this matter. He's not truly caring for us. Our God cares for us. Give us only vegetables, the diet of the creator of the universe. This is a very scientific sort of approach, right? It's like, okay, we're going to do an observation test. You're going to try us and see, and we're going to do just 10 days, and we're going to see if there's a difference. This is going to set the stage for other stories in Daniel, right? If you refuse to see evidence simply because of your assumptions, that's not a very good scientific view.
Right.
That would be horrible science, and if we want to approach Daniel with that same worldview, then we should approach it at least open-minded.
Who actually wrote the book of Daniel? Because I've heard many different theories on this.
Yeah. So there's two main theories,
Okay.
and these two main theories are, I would say, diametrically opposed to one another. That is, it cannot be a compromise between these two. People either believe that
If you had the privilege of going to church when you were a kid, then you probably grew up hearing the story of Daniel in the lion's den, or maybe even the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The book of Daniel is fascinating, not just because it has a very inspiring story, but because it has prophetic elements. There are many skeptics out there who try to discredit the book's authority on its ability to tell the future. So I needed to know more about this skepticism and more about the book of Daniel in general. We're about to embark on a series together. I've invited Professor Brant Berglin, one of the most scholarly and articulate people I know on the biblical scriptures, to come on and explain the skepticism of the book of Daniel, the context behind why Daniel was written, and to go through the stories and the prophetic nature of Daniel with me. This series is going to be awesome, and today we're going to cover an introduction into the book of Daniel and dive into Daniel 1, where Professor Brant Berglin brings insights that I hope you and I will find amazing. So let's dive in. We're going to get into the book of Daniel. You personally love this book, right?
It's one of my favorites.
This book and the book of Revelation combined, they both kind of, what would you say? They both complement each other.
They
very
do.
well.
I would say that the book of Daniel is essential to understand the book of Revelation, but I would also argue that Daniel is one of a number of books that you have to know. And when I say a number of books, I mean like you need to know most of the Old Testament.
Okay.
The book of Revelation is drawing on all these Old Testament stories. It's retelling them in a new way. The book of Revelation is a narrative, although it's also vision. It's also prophecy. People will say, oh, it's apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. Well, the word apocalyptic comes from the book of Revelation itself. Wow. The word revelation in the Greek is apokalypsis, which means to unveil, to reveal. And the book of Daniel is, I think, the Old Testament parallel to Revelation. So to understand especially sections of the book of Revelation, like chapter 13, you really have to understand Daniel.
Okay.
So,
and who actually wrote the book of Daniel? Because I've heard many different theories on this.
Yeah. So there's two main theories,
Okay.
and these two main theories are, I would say, diametrically opposed to one another. That is, it cannot be a compromise between these two. People either believe that a man named Daniel, who was a Jewish exile from Jerusalem, exiled by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar sometime around 600. We can talk about that date in a little bit, but around the time of 600 BC, so 600 years or so before Jesus was born, he was a Jewish nobleman. Maybe the text implies he has royal blood. So of the line of Judah, of the line of the kings. And Daniel, if it is that man Daniel, then everything he writes is from a first-person perspective from his experience during his time in Babylon. That is the first option. The second option is, no, the book is what we call pseudonymous. It's falsely named. It's attributed to Daniel to give it some credibility, but in reality, the book of Daniel was written by someone in the 150s, 160s BC during the time of the Maccabean revolt as an attempt to try and give hope to his people that, look, God is still with us. He's been with our people down through the Babylonian captivity, and now he'll be with us too. But he writes the book as if he's writing from, a couple hundred years before, pretending that it's prophecy. It would be like me today writing a letter and dating it 1980, right? 1980, and then predicting the fall of the World Trade Center on 9/11. I wrote the letter pretending it was prophecy, but I really wrote it after the fact.
Okay, so this matters then.
Oh, it matters tremendously.
Okay.
And the reasons why people would date it early or late depend in many ways on our a priori assumptions. That is, the beliefs we have going into the reading of the text. It's not like people are just reading the text and saying, well, I'll just let the text speak for itself. People go to Daniel with, I guess, an agenda because the book is so polarizing. The book claims to be prophecy. And if it claims to be prophecy, if it isn't prophecy, then a lot of the beliefs of Christianity and Judaism that hinge on these supposed prophecies fall on their face. And if you're a skeptic and you want to, shine the light of, truth on Daniel, and you say, well, Daniel's not a real prophet, then you'll use every argument you can to try and make it look like Daniel's book isn't prophecy. On the other hand, if you come to the biblical text with a worldview that assumes there is a God and he can tell the future, then you're going to look for evidence to support that. It's rare to see people come to Daniel and just say, hey, I really don't know. Let's put all the cards on the table and let's just see where it lays, right? And let's see where the evidence points us. And I will tell you that I am not in the camp of somebody who can come to the book of Daniel with a purely open mind, because I have a lot of background in studying the book. I've weighed the arguments, yes, but I'm also a Christian believer, and because of that, I tend to see the possibilities in Daniel that it could be prophetic. I understand some of the arguments that are made that it's not Daniel, and we can talk about those if you want. We can talk about the challenges to the book. I think in terms of the Old Testament books, no book has been as criticized or as critiqued by skeptics as Daniel. And the reason why that is because if it is prophecy, it is dramatic. Like, it is unquestionably dramatic. And it's hard then to argue that there isn't a God behind the text.
Yeah.
And so thus it becomes a focal point, much like the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yeah. It becomes a focal point of attack.
So who do you believe wrote it then? And what's your evidence for it?
Okay, so let's talk about what the skeptics would say first, and then I'll show you why I think some of those views are worth hearing, but not convincing for me. Okay? So number one, skeptics who read the book of Daniel come to the book of Daniel with the a priori assumption that there is no God. Okay? If you believe there is no God, and then you read the book of Daniel and it projects itself as prophecy, well, if there's no God, or you're not sure, even an agnostics, I want to be honest here, an agnostic, I don't know if there's a God, they would be skeptical because the book claims to be prophecy. Well, no one can really know the future, and especially if Daniel is detailed in foretelling the future, then we would call that into question, right? So our a priori assumptions matter, and so number one, the assumption, well, there's no God, thus Daniel can't be prophetic. Okay. The second is that there are parts of Daniel, the little horn in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. There's sections of Daniel 11 and 12, well, 11 really, that seem to speak to the time period of the Maccabean revolt, which was a time when the Jews revolted against the Syrians under Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jews, led by the Maccabees, the family of Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, they revolted against Syria and they overthrew them. And Israel won their independence. Oh, really? They had been under the thumb of Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, under Greece, and when Greece was divided up into, after the death of Alexander the Great, into the different regions that became known as kind of the Greek city-states, and then these major areas, including Syria and the area, the Ptolemies in the south in Egypt. What we find is that the Maccabean revolt has some affinity to the language of Daniel 7, 8, and 10. Really? When we see the little horn there, it kind of looks on the surface like some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did, right, in persecuting the Jews. And so scholars have said, well, see, the book of Daniel is all about the 2nd century BC. It's all about the 150s, 160s. And thus, because there's no such thing as prophecy, Daniel must have been living during that time, right? And he only pretended that he wrote the book earlier and used the name of Daniel to give himself some credibility. Okay. So the name Daniel does show up in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14. It mentions Job and it mentions Noah, and it says even if Job, Noah, and Daniel were in the land, they could only save themselves. They couldn't save the people around them because Israel has turned from me, right? So, and you can go back and read those sections on your own. But the argument is often made that, hey, how could Ezekiel name Daniel? How could he name him that early in his book when Daniel wouldn't necessarily have even had the reputation of wisdom yet. He still would have been a young man when Ezekiel was making these prophecies in the first half of his book, right?
Yeah.
So I think the best argument for that is, A, Daniel could have been a wise man even in Israel, a young man certainly, but he could have been a wise young man in Judah, in Jerusalem, before he was taken captive. Okay. He could have been known. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
The second is, I have no problem with Ezekiel, when he's compiling all of his literature to put his book out, make it known, all of his writing things back into that story. Mm-hmm. And I don't have any problem with that. It would be no problem for me if I'm writing a book and it takes me 40 years to write the book to go back and make edits earlier. That's not an issue. Some people say, oh, well, it had to be original for when he wrote it. That's not a problem for me. Not one bit of a problem. But nevertheless, the book of Daniel, even if I'm kind of getting into the arguments against the skeptics, but even if it was written in the 150s or 160s, even if it was, the prophecies of Daniel extend beyond Antiochus Epiphanes. They extend beyond the 200s AD or BC, and that needs to be wrestled with. Okay, another argument that's often made is a literary one, and the literary one is that there are some words in the book of Daniel that show Persian influence. And they suggest, well, those Persian words would not have been known by Daniel and his friends, except that the book of Daniel certainly includes a time when Persian leadership took over, right, under Cyrus and Darius the Mede. And we can talk about those later. Cyrus and Darius might even be the same person. We'll talk about why that is. But those words certainly they're court words. They're words that would have been used in royal court language. So there's no question that those words are appropriate. The problematic words are the Greek ones. In chapter 3, it talks about all these instruments that are used in the worship of an image that gets set up, that everyone is forced to worship, and Daniel and his friends refuse to worship the image. And because they don't fall down when the music plays. They're thrown into a furnace, and they're supposed to be executed, and God saves them. Mm-hmm. But the list, there's this list of instruments there over and over. It lists both the number of satraps and governors and everybody who falls down or is supposed to fall down and worship the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then when you hear the music, when you hear the psaltery and the harp and the zither and the lyre, and it lists all these words, there's 3 Greek words that are names of instruments that come from Greece. And the argument is made that, well, there's no way Daniel writing in, let's say he wrote in the year 560, 550, 560, 570, somewhere in there. Let's say somewhere in there. There's no way that Daniel would have known those names of those instruments. So because Daniel couldn't have known them, they're Greek words. Greece came after the Medes and the Persians, so it really makes sense that Daniel would be using those words if he lived in the 2nd century, not 300 years, 400 years before. Okay. That's another argument they make. Yet another argument is that Daniel is not knowledgeable historically. He writes about people that have no basis in history, such as King Belshazzar, who's supposedly the son of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 5. Until recently, there was no evidence outside the biblical book of Daniel that there was such a guy. And so skeptical scholars through the 17 and 1800s, up till the mid-1800s, were adamant that Daniel simply made the name up. See, he doesn't know what he's talking about. If he'd lived back there during the time of Daniel or during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, he would have known that there's no such guy. He never would have made up such a name. So that's an argument that's often made. And that goes also for the name Darius the Mede in chapter 6. We don't know who Darius the Mede is. Yeah. There's no evidence for a guy named Darius the Mede who takes the throne at age 62. So who is that? It's like, that's interesting. And so because Daniel is making these historical statements and he gets them wrong, he certainly is from a later period, because if he lived at the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, he would have got those details right. Then there's some arguments made prophetically, and that is Daniel, he says he's apparently pointing to Antiochus Epiphanes, but he can't even get the details right of how long, the 2300 evening morning of Daniel 8 supposedly is, 2300 literal days where Antiochus would have this power and desolate the temple and the sanctuary. But that doesn't describe literally how long Antiochus took. So therefore, he doesn't even know the right events. He says he's predicting Antiochus Epiphanes, but he doesn't even get those events right. So not only is Daniel a prophet who's dated wrongly, he's attributing his name to a time when it didn't happen, he doesn't even get the events right of his own day. And so these are the arguments that skeptics bring out. And I hope I'm doing justice to their main arguments. There could be others as well. The fact that the book of Daniel is written in two different languages. It starts out in the book of in Hebrew language from chapter 1 up through 2 verse 3, 4. And then it switches to Aramaic. And it's in Aramaic all the way down to the end of chapter 7. And then it switches back to Hebrew for chapters 8 through 12. And scholars have said, well, that's evidence right there that Daniel's writing in Aramaic. Daniel would not have spoken Aramaic, early on back then. He would, Aramaic became the language of the Jews much later.
Interesting.
So those are the main arguments I think skeptics would say, And their first one drives a lot of the others. That is the assumption, the a priori assumption, there's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as prophecy, because that would be evidence of God. And I've already assumed and I have already accepted there is no God. Thus, Daniel can't be prophetic. If he's telling the future, then he's doing so on some method they have no idea about, and they simply reject that out of hand.
What's the evidence for Daniel being the...
So, in a way, we have to go back and relook at each one of these issues, okay? So, the first one, the a priori assumption, if you go into the text of Daniel simply with an open mind, you can go into it agnostic, simply open-minded, though, and say, hey, maybe there is a God. I'm going to let the text inform me. And then you start there, you'll at least give the book the option to tell its own story. You don't have to force your own worldview on the book. Now, I can already hear the critics saying, yeah, but Christians and Jews do this as well. Absolutely, and I agree. We come to the text with our own lenses on. I'm just saying that I think a Christian comes at least open-minded enough to say, I think there could be a God. I'm not trying to prove it. I think there could be. And if that's the case, then I'm open to Daniel being prophetic. I'm open to the future being known. Okay? So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
And so for me, the skeptic is not an open-minded position. It is a very closed-minded one, right? And I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying that in terms of a priori assumptions, that assumption will cut out all kinds of evidence. If you refuse to see evidence simply because of your assumptions, that's not a very good scientific view.
Right.
That would be horrible science. And if we want to approach Daniel with that same worldview, then we should approach it at least open-mindedly.
Okay.
So that would be my call. If you're a skeptic, try being a little more open-minded and just see. Okay. All right, the next arguments we can look at, and I'm going to take these maybe in a different order, but when we look at the story of Daniel, let's go back to the language. Starts in Hebrew, shifts to Aramaic, shifts back to Hebrew. And that's very interesting. Why would the book do that? And what kind of Hebrew, what kind of Aramaic is it that we're seeing? So I teach some Hebrew at the university here where I'm a professor. And Hebrew in the Old Testament Hebrew text is noted for the fact that it often gives the verb first, then the subject of the verb, and then the direct object after that, right? So it starts out, he gave God to Abraham a son, right? So it often starts with the verb, then it has the subject of the verb. The language in Daniel follows that. It follows that Hebrew. But the Hebrew that was being spoken later, and there was less Hebrew, it was more Aramaic, before the time of Jesus, but the Hebrew of, for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls starts out with the subject and then the verb more often. So Daniel's Hebrew reflects an earlier Hebrew, not a later Hebrew.
Yeah.
Okay? And the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, sometime between perhaps 150, again, Maccabean revolt up through 70 AD, up through the time of the Roman conquest. And the Hebrew language there is different, even though we have some texts of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. So the Aramaic section, would Daniel have learned Aramaic while he was in Babylon? The answer is yes. In fact, when the exiles left Babylon, Aramaic was the language spoken by the exiles. We know this because the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that recount the return of the Babylonian captives, Daniel, we don't know, went with them. He might have been too old. But when they left Babylon, they spoke Aramaic. And this Aramaic section of Daniel is reflective of the Aramaic of Ezra and Nehemiah, which people don't dispute is written post-exilic near the time of Cyrus. So for that reason alone, the Aramaic section and the Hebrew section reflect an earlier Hebrew. So let's talk about some of the loan words. You and I live in a world where we have instruments today. If you were to sit down at a keyboard, what's the Latin term for that keyboard? Do you know the term?
I do not know.
What do you call a big thing with keys?
Piano?
A piano. How about an instrument?
Violin?
What's the bigger one? Do you know? The viola?
Viola.
These are not English words. We did not get those words from English, right? We got those from Europe. We got those from Italy. We get words like that from Germany, right? We get the pianoforte, right? Latin. We get our words. These are loan words. It's interesting to me that if you go back 150 years ago, those words were still being used, right? And we know them today.
Yeah.
And yet those words, the moment the pianoforte came out, it was a pianoforte. It didn't matter what country you went to. And there's plenty of evidence that the loan words of these instruments were already in use in the 350s, 400 BC in other cultures outside of Greece.
Okay.
So there's no problem with those words, those instruments being there. And there's no problem also with the Cortesian language of the Persians being in Daniel. Daniel and his friends were in a Persian court under the reign of Darius and Cyrus. So no problem there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So all right. So those arguments, if you want to make it, it's blowing those things out of proportion to a degree that it's just not tenable to make your whole argument based on a few words.
Right.
Okay. The bigger issues are, what about the historicity?
Yes.
So here's where we get to really the meat of it. King Belshazzar, up until the mid-1800s, was unknown to any literature outside of the book of Daniel or books that reference Daniel, okay? Like Josephus.
Yeah.
Josephus cites Daniel and mentions Belshazzar, but we had no evidence from Babylon that such a guy named Belshazzar existed. So the skeptics, what did they say? Well, Daniel's making it up. We don't know of a guy named Belshazzar, therefore, Daniel is a false prophet. He's making things up. To their shock and chagrin, in the mid-1800s, Babylonian cuneiform tablets were found with Belshazzar's name on it. And as best as even secular scholars have reconstructed, Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, who most likely married into Nebuchadnezzar's family. And when Nebuchadnezzar passed away, he left his kingdom to his daughter, perhaps Nitocris. There's questions about this, but his daughter Nitocris, who marries Nabonidus. Nabonidus now becomes king through marriage, and their son is Belshazzar.
Okay.
And so now all of a sudden the skeptics who have said, see, Daniel's making this up. No. In fact, not only is Daniel not making it up, by the time the 150s BC came around and the Maccabean revolt, right, when Daniel supposedly was writing, according to the skeptics, there was no knowledge of Belshazzar anymore. He had fallen off the stage of history. We didn't have access to those Babylonian documents. No other document mentions him. The only way Daniel could have known about Belshazzar is if he lived back then.
That's crazy.
So, and then we have the problem with Darius the Mede. And granted, there is no name Darius the Mede as far as we can tell, but in any source, there is another Darius the Great, that's mentioned in Ezra, but not in Daniel. And so the question is, who is this guy? Was he making him up? Well, if we want to argue he's making him up, we run into the problem of Belshazzar now, because maybe a little archaeological evidence would show that we're wrong by making that point, right? Oh, Daniel's just making it up. Belshazzar should serve as a caution and a warning. Be careful that you don't get so skeptical that you write off data just because there's an absence of data.
Yeah.
An absence of evidence does not demand an evidence of absence, right? So what we would basically say is that with Darius the Mede, there are several options that could fit with history. Number one, that is Darius could be a title. And if it's a title, not a name, right? A title, then this title or this kingly name could be given to anybody. Some have suggested that Gobirus or Ugbaru, one of the generals from the Persian army who could have been of Median descent, could have taken that title and sat on the throne while Cyrus continued his campaign, right, his conquest campaigns, and he left one of his generals on the throne in Babylon. It was a big city. So we need to make sure it doesn't fall into revolt, right? So you need a presence there. That's very possible.
Okay.
It's also possible that if Darius is a title, 62 years of age is also the age in which Cyrus apparently captured Babylon. It's possible that Darius is simply the title for Cyrus himself, and then this is no problem. It's Cyrus who ascends the throne and then goes on his conquests later on. So no problem there. So I think the argument of historicity, because Belshazzar was argued that he didn't exist, and it turns out he did, we ought to be very cautious if we make the same argument about Darius the Mede. Daniel appears to know what he's talking about. And he talks about things as if he were there, and he knows things that only someone who was there could have known, like Belshazzar.
That's awesome. That's awesome. This episode seems like a good episode for somebody to come back to after we finish the book of Daniel.
Absolutely.
Because this will give more context to all these characters.
And the things we're going to look at in the book itself. Right.
Exactly. So that's awesome. So I guess we're going to get into the story of Daniel.
Okay.
Right? Because Daniel 1 through 6, isn't that basically like the story of Daniel? And then after that, it gets into more prophetic.
Yeah, so the structure of the book of Daniel, we've already mentioned one structure, and that's the language structure, right? Chapters 1 through the first few verses of chapter 2, and then chapters 8 through 12 are Hebrew with an Aramaic section in the middle. That's one structure of the book, right? The language one. There's another structure, and that is chapters 1 through 6, for the most part, are narrative, while chapters 7 through the end of 12 are more prophetic, visionary, apocalyptic, if we even want to go that far. I know scholars like John J. Collins might argue that, others might not, but we'll assume for the moment that apocalyptic literature includes both the narrative portion and the prophetic portion, and it isn't like they are exclusively narrative or prophetic, because you see prophecy in chapter 2. In fact, Daniel 2 is overlaid with Daniel 7. Daniel 2 has a vision that King Nebuchadnezzar has. In Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision, and those two visions overlap almost exactly. So we need to make sure that we don't try and separate those sections too much, right? Okay. But we see congruity and continuity throughout the book. We can't divide it that easily,
right?
Because even Daniel's visions later on relate back to certain time periods of those kings, right? So we'll see that when we get to those sections.
Okay. So we're going to get into Daniel 1 today. Tell me a little bit about the context about this chapter that we're getting into. What led up to this point?
So the introduction to the book of Daniel is really the story of the downfall of the kingdom of Judah.
Okay. Which was...
So a number of years before, during the reign of the son of King Solomon, the son of King David, like the height of the Jewish Israelite monarchy, right? The son of Solomon basically led with an iron hand, and the people revolted. And the 10 tribes of Israel in the north seceded from the union of Israel, right? Basically, it would be like 2/3 of the United States seceding from the other third, and it would be a civil war. Right. So basically there was civil war in Israel, and that's what happened. In 722 BC, the Assyrians came into the northern kingdom and wiped out the 10 tribes in the north. And so all that was left, for all practical purposes, there was a dispersion of the tribes in the north, and many of them were wiped out. For all practical purposes, all that's left is Judah, some from Benjamin, and some Levites. Like, that's it. That's the only Jews that are left, and Jerusalem is their center, right? But as the northern tribes of Israel fell into apostasy, so the southern kingdom of Judah also began to fall into apostasy. And you can read through the Jewish prophets on this. But essentially, the conclusion to the sad story of Israel's monarchy ends with King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He and his father Nabopolassar, has this conquest against Egypt, which is successful, and they get most of the land of Palestine back from Egypt. And Israel, of course, is caught in this major crossfire of these two big nations. Yeah. And in the process, Nebuchadnezzar comes to the city of Babylon, or the city of Jerusalem, and lays siege to it. And we see the conclusion of the story really in the Old Testament book of Chronicles. And if I can read the very last couple verses of 2 Chronicles, you'll see that it actually tells really well the context here. And the Lord God, this is chapter 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 15. And the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God. They despised his words, they scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. He had no compassion on young man or virgin, on aged or weak. He gave them all into his hand, and all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, that is the temple, right? And the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then they burned down the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons, until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths, as long as she lay desolate. She kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. And that's interesting, because the conquest then by King Nebuchadnezzar of Judah actually fulfills God's plan for his land, because he had told Israel, every 7 years you are to let the land lie fallow, the land is to have a Sabbath, and you are to take a whole year Sabbath off. And apparently the land had not been doing that. In fact, we have no record of it from the time they enter into the land during the time of the conquest under Joshua and the judges. We have no evidence they ever kept the sabbatical year.
Why don't we have a whole year of Sabbath off? That would be great.
Great question. I think it'd be wonderful. But and maybe we'd be better off mental health-wise if we would take, at least the weekly Sabbath and then the yearly as well. But anyways, here then it says that the land needed its rest, and so God sent Nebuchadnezzar as a tool to punish his people. Okay? When you come to the first chapter of the book of Daniel, it basically mirrors this. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord, that is Yahweh, the God of Israel, gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So this is not just a normal war. This is a spiritual war. This is a my dad's bigger than your dad sort of war. My God's bigger than your God. Nebuchadnezzar is given the power over the Israelite people because God said, my people have fallen into apostasy. You can have them. Go punish them for a while. I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but essentially the Babylonian captivity was God's hand using Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar wants credit for all these conquests of Israel, and the God of Israel says, no, I let you.
He's going to find that out later, right?
He's going to find that out later. Yeah, I let you do that as a way of punishing my people. So that's the context here. Okay. And it's a sad one. The good news is at the end of 2 Chronicles, and I didn't read the last couple verses of chapter 36, but it says that they would be in exile until the reign of Cyrus, the king of Persia, and then they would get to come home.
It says that in Chronicles.
In Chronicles. And that's the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, the return of the exiles from captivity.
Was Chronicles written at the same time as Daniel, or was it?
Chronicles was written later, and it is a retelling of Kings and 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, but with a focus on the temple, a focus on the sanctuary, how Israel had abandoned the sanctuary of God and what was supposed to happen there. Worship. The law was supposed to be read, right? The practice of sacrificing a lamb, looking forward by faith to what God was going to do to provide salvation for his people. All of that was left behind. The people instead turned to other gods and their temples, and thus the temple, the sanctuary, becomes a centerpiece of the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
Oh, interesting.
They're a retelling of Israel in light of their failures because of the captivity.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense.
So, okay, now Daniel and his friends, it says, are carried away as well, and it says that they're brought into the land of Shinar. That's an interesting phrase, right? Do you know the land of Shinar? Do you know what that has to do with in the Bible? So the land of Shinar is the land in the book of Genesis where the people after the biblical flood of Noah built a huge city in the land of Shinar. And they called the city, and the city ended up being called Babel because Babel, right, which the name Babylon comes from that word Babel because there God had confused the languages of the people. And Nebuchadnezzar was trying to rebuild that old Babel kingdom as a place of shaking your hand against the God of heaven, right? And saying, no, we're not going to let you have power and control over us. You can never destroy us. And so he wants a new Babel kingdom. And it's in the same country. It's in the land of Shinar, the same place, right? And his city is named the same name, Babylon, right? So very interesting, because that gives us some context then. Then the king instructed, I'm reading verse 3, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. That's like getting a master's degree, right? Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So Daniel and his friends are brought in before Ashpenaz, and some versions, and I don't know what version you have there for in verse 3.
I think I just have the NIV.
NIV, and this is a New King James. The NIV probably says the chief of his court officials.
Yes.
I think, yes. This one says the master of his eunuchs, and the Hebrew word here is saris, and saris is the term that is used back when when Isaiah the prophet speaks to the king Hezekiah and says, a great calamity is going to come on your nation because of your disobedience and that of others. But because you've humbled yourself, it won't come on you. It'll come on your children. And your children and their children, your offspring, your descendants, will go into the land of Babylon, and they will become eunuchs. They will become eunuchs. And the word saris is eunuch. So a person who has had their male genitalia removed surgically, and we don't know if it was castration of just the testicles or the whole thing, but nevertheless they would have been made eunuchs. Why eunuchs? Well, so that they no longer had any opportunity to be engaged with the king's harem.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They had no interest in sexual things, and thus the need for a family, the need for offspring, the need for offspring who could rebel and set up their own kingdom, right? All of a sudden that ends. If you're going to work closely with the king, you can't have any offspring. And so that ends up being the case. The king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his saris, most likely here should be translated eunuch. So they bring these young men in, and think about all the things that change for these young men. Their place of living changes, right? Their language changes. They go from Hebrew to Aramaic. And when you change languages, you change culture, right? They're now being trained, instead of in their own school of the prophets, they're now being trained in Babylon University, right? They're given new names. Their names Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Names that are important, right? Daniel, God is my judge, right? My judge is God, something like that, right? And then Hananiah, right? The same thing, God is gracious. These Hebrew names are filled with meaning, and now they're given names that represent the gods of Israel, Bel and Nabu. So these names are interesting, but what's really unique is for those who study a lot of Hebrew and Babylonian language, it sounds like these names are not accurate reflection of Hebrew names, but they're actually twisted Hebrew names, or Babylonian names, twisted Babylonian names. So instead of Belshazzar, who is what Daniel's name probably should be, which means God preserve his king, something like that, it's God preserve the goat. Or
interesting.
Yeah, it's like they're taking the name and mispronouncing them and saying, yeah, we're not going to use those names exactly the way we'll mispronounce them and kind of get ourselves off the hook. We're not going to give honor to your gods by taking those names. But now their food has changed as well, right? The king is offering them the delicacies of his table, and he's saying, look, I will care for you. I will be your father. I will be your daddy. I'll take care of you. And the Jews had no choice in having their sexuality changed, their language changed, their place of residence. They have no family anymore. They've been separated from so many things have changed. Their education, none of those things were within their power to change, right? but there were limits to what they would, to their ability to be forced into this new mold. The names is one of them. They said, okay, we'll take the names, but we're not going to pronounce them right. We're going to poke fun at your gods just a little with the names, and you'll just think we're mispronouncing them because we're Jewish, right? Maybe. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. It's like, I'm in charge of you guys, and if you guys don't look as good as you can, the king's going to remove my head from my body. So, I need you guys to eat the food that's offered you, please. You guys, this is good food. It's fit for you. So why would Daniel and his friends not want to eat this food? There's a number of reasons. What can you think of? Why might they not?
I mean, you kind of refer to it at the beginning, like Nebuchadnezzar is trying to say, "Hey, I'm your God. I'm going to be your provider," and Daniel's saying, "No, I have one God, and that is the God of heaven."
That's the God of heaven, the God who created the world. Yeah. And when Daniel says, he says, "No, please give me. I'm not going to eat this food. Please only give me, good food to eat." This idea of defilement. When we read the next section, we see what he's given. Verse 11. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined." And so what Daniel is offering is he's saying, look, I want the food that was offered in Eden when God made people and he was God over them. I want the Edenic diet. Give me water and every green plant that's good for food. Right? That's all I want. I don't want the king's delicacies. Some people have suggested, Daniel and his friends were being asked to eat food that was sacrificed to idols, or they were being asked to eat food that was non-kosher, right? Some of the animals that are listed in Deuteronomy 14 or Leviticus 11 that they weren't supposed to touch. Camels and pigs and certain types of fish and certain kinds of birds. They weren't supposed to eat those, right? It's likely that that's not exactly what's going on here. It's more likely that this is about the power issue. Daniel and his friends said, we're not going to be subject to the king's leadership in this matter. He's not truly caring for us. Our God cares for us. Give us only vegetables, the diet of the creator of the universe. And it's kind of an underhanded and subtle way of saying we're still going to resist. We're still members of the kingdom of the God of heaven, not of your kingdom.
I'm kind of shocked that they allowed them to do this.
But this is wise. Take a look at what they said. They said, let us propose a test. Let's try 10 days, right? Then after 10 days, let our appearance be examined by you and the appearance of the other young men who eat the portions of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, deal with your servants. So this is a very scientific sort of approach, right? It's like, okay, we're going to do an observation test. We're going to have a control group. We're going to have those young men who continue to eat the king's food, and then we'll have the small group of us who we're going to be your test sample, right? And you're going to try us and see, and we're going to do just 10 days, and we're going to see if there's a difference. And if there's a difference after 10 days and we look bad, that still gives you time to get us back on the other food, okay? If, on the other hand, things look the same, well, then maybe you'll let us. And if we look better, then you'll know where to go. So those are kind of the options, right? Okay. You'll look worse, you'll look the same, you'll look better. At the end of the 10 days, verse 15, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of the delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them only vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Notice that Daniel and his friends, exiled to this land, they could have just said, we're not going to do it. We're going to cross arms. We're not going to do anything you ask. Well, okay, we're not going to eat the food, but we'll still learn. We're still wise. We're still bright. And we're happy to learn the things you want to teach us. It doesn't mean we're going to believe them, but we're happy to learn it. We'll still go to school. We'll take the classes you require, and we'll learn. And in the end, it says that at the end of the days when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all of his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Wow. So we end with a temporal marker foreshadowing the coming of another king. Nevertheless, Daniel and his friends tried, tested, found faithful to God, and God honored them and gave them favor in the court of the king. That's as good a case as you can imagine for where this story is going to go. That's as good a beginning as you can imagine, considering all that was taken from them.
That's great.
So
That's awesome.
Daniel and his friends, faithful to the living God, even though it's an undercurrent, it's not explicitly stated, they were still faithful to him, and God honors them, even though they're in Babylon because of punishment.
So what do you think are some practical implications that we can draw from Daniel 1?
I think there's lots of times when we'll be asked to compromise parts, and this can go for anybody. You don't have to be a Christian, but we'll be asked to compromise the things that we believe are true or the things that are important to us. Okay. And I think the book of Daniel says there's some things that are outside of our control. It's okay to let some of those things go. I can't control everything around me, and I shouldn't have to. But there are places where it comes time to draw a line in the sand. There's a place for resistance. Yeah. And when that place comes, you should know what it is, and you shouldn't compromise. Daniel and his friends didn't, and God gave them favor for standing up and creating some boundaries. Wow. And I think especially for Christians and for people like Jews who say, we live in a world that is not in favor of our faith. Stand for your faith. Don't walk away. Stand for it. There's things you can't control, and there's things you can. Try and know the difference.
I was just listening to a podcast, and that's great. That's a great thought. Sorry. Kind of just jumped into something.
Yeah, that's right.
I was just listening to a podcast. It was Andrew Tate and another guy who claims to be a Christian, and they're talking back and forth. And I was like, this is probably one of the best podcasts I've heard with him talking with someone else, because he's challenging his perspective, because Andrew Tate claims to be a Muslim now.
Okay.
And he's saying that Christians are weak and they haven't stood up for their faith and stuff in America. And the other guy's saying, well, that's not completely true. Of course, there are people that stand up for their faith. And they both came to the conclusion that, yes, you should be standing up for your faith, like you're saying, and stand strong. The problem, maybe we don't completely agree with how certain Muslim groups stick up for their faith.
And they might disagree with how some Christians do.
Exactly. But the concept of Daniel, or the implication that we can draw from Daniel, like you're saying, is the way we can stand up for our faith is by keeping the principles that are set before us in the Word of God. And that's why it's so important to try to keep that relationship close with God.
Absolutely.
So that you can become like him and model his character.
And then know what those issues are. Because
Exactly.
Daniel and his friends, this is going to set the stage for other stories in Daniel, right? Especially chapters 3 and chapter 5 and 6, 3 and 6 especially. But when you're called to stand up for your faith, like, it can be life or death.
Yeah.
I mean, not just psychologically life or death, which can happen too, but actual life and death.
Yeah.
And we don't live in a place in the world right now here in America where that's the case often, but you can certainly get canceled in America. You can certainly lose your prestige. You can lose your reputation. I know people who have lost their jobs over their faith. And that's interesting in a place that, in a country that claims to have a religious freedom.
Let me ask you this question.
Sure.
If religious freedom is in question, should we use force to fight against it?
Oh, yeah, I struggle with that. That's a whole podcast of its own. Jesus said his kingdom is not of this world. If it was, his disciples would fight. So we're not trying to set up certainly some kind of earthly kingdom of God. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have some obligation of fighting for my country, perhaps, right? If I'm a citizen of a country, and I know a lot of Christians who have said, I'll be a non-combatant. Fair enough. I know others who have said, I think I would fight for freedom as long as I knew that's what I was fighting for. The problem is war is never that simple. Right. And so it's a challenge. We can talk more about that on another podcast. Daniel and his friends don't end up fighting. They end up resisting in ways that are non-violent, non-threatening, and they end up winning the heart of the king in the process. So there are ways to do this. There might be a time to stand up and fight physically. You better know what it is you're fighting for if it's physical. but there's other ways to stand up as well.
I like that. That's
so
awesome.
hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. So, yep, I like that. I love that. So that's a great place to stop. Brant, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, we'll see you next time for
Yes.
Daniel.